Ursa's sermon this morning is titled Everyday Animism. Any animists out there? All right. Let's talk about what we're talking about. One of my favorite related books is titled Animism, Respecting the Living World. It's by Graham Harvey. He's a professor of religious studies in London. He defines an animist as someone who recognizes that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Those are two pretty interesting, perhaps provocative claims. The world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Some of you have heard me say that the biggest insight I've had from meditating is that it is process and relationship all the way down. Process and relationship all the way down. Let's start by unpacking that first point a little more, that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human. Philosophers and scientists have long debated the definition of personhood, but in general, it has to do with whether a being possesses some degree of self-awareness, of inner subjectivity, of continuous consciousness over time, so a sense of a past and a present and a future, and some capacity for agency and free will. That's what we mean by personhood. And I think people are increasingly convinced that there's a spectrum of that out there. So, humans may have more, but that you have various animals or various places on this spectrum of sentience. An animist worldview invites us to expand our understanding of personhood. Instead of a limited view that holds that we humans have conveniently decided that only humans are persons, right? We're challenged to recognize that other beings on this planet experience forms of sentience and may also deserve to be recognized in some sense as persons. An animist worldview doesn't necessarily mean that one has to become a vegetarian or vegan, although it might prompt you in that direction. You'll hear a little bit more about that. There's a table in the atrium and during the testimony. It is, however, also true that animism arose often in hunter-gatherer societies that often were omnivorous. A key difference is that these societies often also had a deep respect for the natural world, so that if they had to kill another animal to eat and to survive, that animal was treated with deep respect and gratitude, very different from our kind of factory farming system that's very distant from animals. We are potentially missing out if we dismiss animism as, oh, that's just some archaic worldview that literally believes that there's a God in everything down to a grain of rice. What is much more interesting about contemporary animism is the cultivation of this deep reverence for life and a felt sense of relationship with animal life, with plant life, and even with inanimate objects, really feeling a kinship, even with rocks and rivers and seas and wind and the stars and more. And that second part of Harvey's definition, that life is always lived in relationship with others, that is strongly aligned with our UU 7th principle of respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Another way of describing this paradigm shift is the move from an egocentric, shallow ecology to an ecocentric, deep ecology. A shallow ecology is human-centered and human-dominated. That's that pyramid on the right. It can even be seemingly good things, like we should save the rainforest. It might include cures for cancer for humans, or we should reduce carbon emissions to prevent our human cities from being destroyed by increasingly extreme climate change. So on the one hand, I agree with all that, but it's all still human-centered and misses the bigger picture. A deep ecology is ecocentric. We humans become one among many factors in addition to the communities and the needs and the desires and the rights of other parts of the environment that are non-human and need to be taken into account, valued in their own right, not just in the ways that they can serve us, that they are diverse and valuable and important in and of themselves. On the great tree of life, we humans are deeply interdependent with the other ecosystems of this planet. In the minute of silence to follow, I will leave up this slide as an invitation for you to continue to meditate on what it would mean for us as a species to shift further away from an egocentric, shallow ecology to an ecocentric, deep worldview. In that spirit, I'll leave you with these words from the indigenous activist Winona LaDuke, who said, "Environmentalism to me is a strange term. What it's really about is rediscovering your humanity and how your humanity relates to life." It's about rediscovering your humanity and how your humanity relates to life. If we as a species were ever to really grasp that insight in a deeply Darwinian and deeply ecological sense, we would begin to find ourselves on a much more sustainable path to a future. May it be so for ourselves, for the many generations to come, and for all sentient beings.
So, as we humans are all storytelling animals, I'm going to start today with a small story. When I was a child, my family and I lived in Japan. My father was an NIS agent, and we had been stationed at the Marine base in Iwakuni. In our time living there, we were often invited to local community rituals and festivals. One of my favorite memories of living in Japan was the Oban Festival, which is a time to celebrate the spirits of your ancestors. Usually held in July or August, depending on whether the local community used a solar or lunar calendar, this festival is held at night and includes a dance ritual called the Bon Odori, a dance of joy to appreciate the sacrifices of those that came before you. I have a picture of me and my sisters dressed in kimonos, dancing under the light of the paper lanterns, completely lost in the wild abandon that comes with ecstatic dance, or in this case, a dash of excitement about being up way past my bedtime. Buddhism was introduced to Japan in the 6th century Common Era and is still heavily practiced, but the indigenous religion of Japan is Shinto, a word often translated to something along the lines of the way of the kami or the way of the gods. An animist and polytheistic religion, the concept of Shinto is woven into the very fabric of the cultural mindset of Japan, and it syncretized well with Buddhism when Buddhism arrived as a major religion. So the kami of Japan could be specific deities, forces of nature, landscapes, even ideas, or venerated ancestors long gone. For example, the island of Miyajima, which is dedicated to 3 different sea goddesses, is itself considered to be a kami. The entire island is considered a sacred liminal space. To be in harmony with your surroundings and aware of the interconnective energy of all beings is to be conscious of Kanagara no Michi, or the way of the kami. I truly believe we are all born with this consciousness, and it is within all of us to be able to return to it. I often say I've been a polytheist since childhood, and that is directly influenced by living in Japan. I would also further identify as a lifelong animist for the same reason. So, what is animism? To quote Catherine Swancutt from the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Anthropology, animism is both a concept and a way of relating to the world. Reverend Carl mentioned earlier a quote from scholar and animist Graham Harvey. Animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. So today, I'm going to focus more on the relating to the world and living in relationship with others part by exploring different ways we, as individuals and communities, can relate to our world in a practical, compassionate, animist way of life. So for those who don't know a little background on me, I am a Unitarian Universalist pagan. More specifically, I practice a type of paganism called heathenry, which is based on the deities and lore of Germanic and Scandinavian Europe. The word heathen comes from an Old English word meaning person of the heaths or person from the country, and was originally a pejorative term for a person who had not yet converted to Christianity. This term has been reclaimed in modern times. An inherently animist tradition, heathenry is largely reconstructed from the sagas, poetic and prose Eddas, and archaeological records. Christianization of Scandinavia in the 8th to 12th centuries, many of the old traditions were lost, and so therefore heathenry is considered a mostly broken line. Many Reconstructionist heathens try to recreate old rituals and ways of life as accurately as possible based on what we know of the past. There are also revivalist heathens who prefer to use modern practices in a modern context. Personally, I fall somewhere in between these two groups, utilizing historical approaches and traditions where appropriate, combined with the belief that our gods are not static. They evolve and adapt just as we do. Animism is one of the foundational bedrocks of heathenry, and there is historical evidence for this worldview. There is also a contemporary need for an interconnected, community-based worldview where we all look out for each other, non-human persons included. In the solutions-focused climate crisis anthology titled All We Can Save, Christine E. Nieves Rodriguez states that when disaster happens, the person that is right in front of you is your best chance at survival. The times we will be facing are going to require us to recognize that the most important thing around us is community. To me, this basically means your neighbors are part of your community. The folks you see at the grocery store, other parents at your kids' school, the people who populate your town are part of your community. Communities are not just the chosen folks you love or know that you get along with. They are the diverse individuals who you may not understand or agree with that live in close proximity to you. When times get bad, it is vital to have some sort of working relationship with these community members. So my husband and I live in a small town in western Loudoun County, Virginia. You may remember when our school board was in the national news, and not for a good reason. Folks were trying to rescind protections for LGBTQIA+ children in Loudoun County Public Schools. That's the kind of place where we live. In our little neighborhood, my husband Liam and I know our immediate neighbors and are familiar with others on the circle. Liam has been a volunteer caretaker to many of the elderly folks who live there, and indeed was responsible for saving the life of an elderly neighbor who lived alone and had fallen in her kitchen. He knew something was off from a feeling, so he went outside to kind of take a look at the house and saw that our neighbor's trash can, which he always took down to the curb for her, was not put out by the garage as it usually was. So he investigated, looked into a window at the back of the house, and saw she was lying motionless on the floor. First responders were called, and she was checked out and taken care of. The point of the story is that Liam was familiar with the habits of this neighbor, and when he got that little second sense that something was off and that something strange had happened, minuscule that it was, he noticed and was able to respond immediately. I think that's a pretty good example of living in harmony with community. As Reverend Carl said earlier, this concept of living in community certainly reminds me a lot of the Seventh Unitarian Universalist principle: respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So there's no denying it. We're all interconnected. What happens to one person, one community, can be felt in ripples and waves in other people, other communities. We are not islands. Our very energy is woven together into a complex and vibrant tapestry, human and non-human persons alike. Living out the seventh principle in my daily life is a way for me to relate to the world from an animist point of view. And it's not always easy. The Western culture we live in is a creation born mostly of white supremacy, institutionalized racism, colonialism, and capitalism. Those ways of interacting with the world and other people are antithetical to animism. However, it is still possible to exist in our current society as an animist as we work for a better world. So in heathenry, we have a concept of beings called the landvitir, or land spirits. These are literally the non-human persons with whom we share our world. In the book Demons and Spirits of the Land, Ancestral Lore and Practices, Claude Lecateau explains that he uses the translation of land spirit from the Latin genius loci, or place spirit, to refer specifically to a spirit of the wild land, often an uncultivated place not inhabited by human persons. You may have heard of a story in 1999 out of County Clare, Ireland, involving a fairy tree that was inconveniently located in the path of a new motorway that was being built. Out of respect for the ancient hawthorn tree and on the advice of very smart local folklorists, the county engineer redesigned the motorway to go well around the tree. Or you might have heard stories from Iceland about delayed roadworks projects as engineers figured out how to avoid disturbing areas that are considered sacred to the local spirits or elves. Sometimes we may chuckle at some of these so-called superstitions, but it would be good to reflect on these stories as examples of showing respect to non-human persons, as well as honoring local cultural places of importance. In fact, I believe these examples serve as important reminders that communities can come together to slow down or even halt the destruction of sacred wild places, and reinforce the idea that just because someone isn't human doesn't mean they don't deserve respect. So what can we, folks living here in the United States, do to live a more animist life? I have always found that it is easier to connect to a spirit or non-human person if I have some kind of relationship with them. I often recommend initiating a gift-giving cycle. I live in an area that is more on the suburban, rural side of things. My house backs up to a stand of woods, and we have a fairly decent-sized yard that leads up to those woods. When I first started my gift-giving cycle, I began with simple offerings of cold, clear water and just ground cornmeal. It was my personal decision to not offer alcohol to the local land spirits, even though mead in particular is heavily used in heathen ritual. I did this because I am not the first human person to be on this land, and neither are any of the white colonizers who came before me. The stewards of the area of northwestern Virginia I live in are the Manahoic people, and I personally felt it would be disrespectful to offer foreign and potentially harmful beverages to the local land spirits. With a gift-giving cycle, consistency is important, as is consent. Your local land spirits may not want to have a relationship with you, and that is absolutely their right. But let them see your actions. Let them see you caring for the land. You are still obligated, as a good neighbor and community member, to look after the land, even if the local spirits do not wish to interact with you. How do you do this? Pick up litter and trash. Plant native plants. Don't spray insecticides. In my neighborhood, there is an HOA, so we are forced to mow our lawn. However, I make a point of planting native milkweeds in my flower beds and leaving wild spaces where I can. You'll be able to tell if the land spirits are responding favorably. I can tell by the rabbits that nest under our porch each spring, returning every year to this little safe haven to have their babies. We have snakes sunning themselves on the driveway, cardinals nesting in the bushes, hawks and crows and ravens that live here year-round, turtles nestled in the grass, frogs croaking in the little pond beyond our yard, and bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds visiting the flowers. Learning to listen to the land spirits is also an important piece to changing your worldview. There's a practice I was taught by heathen teacher and community leader Trey Moonwood called lying on the land, and it's literally just that. Find a stretch of land near you that you want to connect with. You can roll out a blanket, sit on a chair, or lie directly on the land as your body allows. Practice deep breathing and listening to the earth. Try not to strain to see or hear messages. Let the land spirits tell you what they want you to know. This is often best done in a more secluded place where you will not be interrupted. And when done consistently, this can be part of your gift-giving cycle. So there's a theory called the seventh generation principle based on an indigenous philosophy from the Haudenosaunee people that any decisions we make currently should result in a healthy and sustainable world 7 generations from now. This is an excellent guide for incorporating an everyday animist view. For example, who are you voting for? What are the environmental policies espoused by your candidate? Are you involved in your community? Do you volunteer for organizations that help people, including non-human ones? I know that sometimes I get overwhelmed by how big the problems are that our world is facing and how small and isolated I can feel. A great technique that I heard about from acclaimed author and witch Byron Ballard is just pick 2 to 3 causes that you care deeply about. Perhaps it is LGBTQ plus justice. Perhaps it's the land back movement, a movement dedicated towards indigenous sovereignty as the original stewards of this land. Whatever it is that fires up your heart, focus on that. And start at the grassroots level. Remember that the most important thing around us is community. Some of my special interest causes, including serving as a spiritual leader in my local pagan community, supporting my local LGBTQ plus community, and striving to be a good steward of the land I live on. My last piece of advice would be don't try and go it alone. Connect to your community. A good circle of friends, a good support network of people, human and non-human, is so important. It can be hard to connect with others, strangely enough, even more so in this time of video chats and texting. If you are struggling to find a community that you feel you belong to, do not give up. Volunteer with like-minded folks, keep showing up for the events, allow the shield around your heart to drop, and allow yourself the gift of connection and respect. And remember that this gift flows both ways. I appreciate your listening today, and I hope that you walk through this day more connected to each other.